Hello, we are Team Cusco, and I'm Kyle Johnson. And on the call, we also have Luke Paustian, Jeff Whittick, and Elena Malamed. And the pilot project we took on was doing general conference talks for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from English into Japanese, and to test the efficacy of using neural machine translation to increase efficiency for such products. We'd like to make a special thanks to Steve Richardson and to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints translation department. They're kind enough to give us over 200,000 pre-prepared aligned segments for training our engine, and we really appreciate them and all the help that they gave us. Now we're going to move on and talk about the data a little bit. So we had to go through several rounds of testing with the data. We had so much data, we almost didn't know what to do with it all. So we had to find ways to cut it down and fit it within the parameters of the trial we were using for Microsoft Custom Translator. What we ended up doing was having the base 10,000 or so training pairs for Microsoft Custom Translator, and we had 4 rounds of tuning, each roughly 1,000 pairs, and then we had 645 testing pairs. We saw a slight increase from round 1 to round 2, about 3 points on the blue scores, but from there was no significant change. We went from 36.76 to again 36.76, and then ended up at 36.79. So we did not see a whole lot of improvement, at least from the blue scores, in our trainings procedures.
So not surprisingly, we did run into some speed bumps with this project, and some of our takeaways, we had a few sort of technical takeaways. One was that Microsoft Custom Translator doesn't handle single quotation marks well into Japanese, and also that quotation marks mess up alignment in Excel. We had a lot of trouble figuring that out, but we got some help from Jesse, and he helped us get that straightened. And we found that even though we had all of this great aligned data, there was still a lot of manual work in the carving up of those aligned segments into training, tuning, and testing chunks, and aligning it in a way that we could use it. And that involved making some decisions that then impacted the quality of the translation. On the more process side of our takeaways, we learned that human evaluation is extremely subjective. We spent a lot of time kind of looking at different phrases and words and deciding, well, how minor or major is this? And also on the process side, we found that when the process changes, the schedule and the division of labor also have to be revised. We had this great windfall of data from Steve Richardson, but it took us a while to revise our processes to catch up with our new situation there. And one takeaway was just that it's best to go through a process on a small scale before you try to tackle it in, quote, a large project.
Yeah, you're still muted.
I'm so sorry. Okay. So like Jeff was saying, we at various points throughout this project had to reassess what we were doing, reevaluate, and with that we have an updated timeline that is actually simpler and more streamlined than our original timeline. It starts with our kickoff meeting and then goes into a cycle of alignment, file prep, training, and then quality analysis and post-editing. And this was repeated for each of the trials that we were doing. And when we saw that the data was flatlining pretty tremendously, we decided that from there we could gather our lessons learned and come to a conclusion about post-edited machine translation for the Church of the Latter-day Saints.
We had to adjust our pricing estimate significantly by roughly 100%. While our initial estimates for time spent aligning were very high, 20 to 30 hours or so, we were able to decrease that, but then we did not anticipate the amount of time it would take to figure out a good streamlined process for data treatment and the amount of times we'd have to reparcel the data to fit it within the parameters of the test that we were running. So that ended up taking over 40 hours, and we also neglected to anticipate the amount of time we'd spend in meetings. So those were the two big kickers that that put us over our initial estimates for budget, but we would obviously be able to better estimate that for a future project.
Okay, so next we're going to be talking about another area that we changed from our initial proposal, which is the scorecard that we used for human evaluation. So on the left, you can see our initial scorecard, which had a couple of areas that we ultimately deemed to be unnecessary in our final evaluation, such as country, which was hardly any country names ever came up in our translations. Language we thought to be a little bit too similar to terminology and style. And we ended up adding a couple new ones, such as punctuation, because there were a couple of punctuation issues that were very prevalent throughout our machine translation, such as misusage of quotes, replacing exclamation marks with periods, etc. And we also added a new section for scripture, which was specifically because scripture the translations would be taken very seriously by a religious community, and we wouldn't want to mistranslate any of those, and those would be set as a higher priority for if the machine translation was making any egregious mistakes. And ultimately, we decided that our guideline would be that if we were to go over a score of 20 within 1,000 words, that we would deem the translation to be to require too much post-editing to be recommended over a human translated project. So as for the results, we actually got 2 native speakers of Japanese to review the machine translated results. And the consensus was that the translation was mostly accurate, but the main issue was the lack of human touch and nuance that came from it, which is very apparent in these kinds of texts that involve religious material and the style of speech that is used in Japanese. The machine translation came off very stiff in certain areas, and some meanings were entirely changed as a result, which made it seem less natural, professional, or official. And our second reviewer actually gave us scores for each of the segments that we provided them, to which the scores of the initial round before testing and the final round were almost exactly the same, only changing by about 0.1 overall. And when we actually did the human evaluation ourselves, we ended up reaching our critical score of 20 within 250 words, as opposed to the 1,000 that we were hoping to keep it under. So we found that our metrics were not quite sufficient in terms of accurately depicting whether or not we could use this data for a proper project, and whether it would be save more time over a human project. And the difference between those rounds, between round 1 and 4, in terms of how quickly they reached the score, was about the same. So it was relatively negligible. So as a lesson learned, scorecard is definitely something that we would need to significantly fine tune in order to provide realistic results. But we will get more into whether we think that it would be a good idea to go over this later in the presentation.
So we were pretty sure after looking at all of our data that we didn't have enough to make a good post-edited machine translation, or to really, grasp the whole amount of nuance that needs to go into it. With our Microsoft Custom Translator subscription, or the free plan, we were not able to use nearly as many files as we could have, because we got such a large amount straight from the church. But we did find ways that we could have sped up the process, and in the future for post-editing and quality analysis, there are some things that could just streamline the process. For one, we believe that if we used regex to take out quotes and specifically scripture from the text, then we can add it during post editing and not have to worry about the translation being wrong or misconstruing the meaning, because we found that that was one of the most important aspects of these sermons, is accurately presenting what's being taught. So we decided to remove scripture before translation would just speed up the process if we could just use a list to insert them after the fact. Also, fixing punctuation using something like Oliphant or a search and replace system could have provided us with better results because of the problems we were having with single quotes. And if we had more firm terminology for certain things like verbs and honorific language that is used in Japan to account for some of the nuances that were lost, perhaps a more consistent translation could be received from it.
So some of the conclusions we reached, one is that some of the translation issues would be hard to resolve with this machine translation engine, including punctuation, scripture style, context. It's such context heavy content. And these talks connect themes that are introduced in the beginning, and a trajectory builds, and then the themes are brought back at the end. And that sort of story arc was not really handled very well by machine translation. We also just think that Japanese isn't generally translated into English isn't generally translated well into Japanese. It's just a very difficult direction to go with machine translation. Our main takeaway, our main conclusion is that we do not recommend going forward with machine translation for these talks, because the advantages, while we could keep training it and gain some minimal advantages over human translation cost-wise, the advantages would be so small that it just seems like it would be more in line with the church's interests and the church's values to just continue to employ human translators who are going to give it that touch that was missing from the machine translation. So we enjoyed the project. We learned a lot, and we learned, one of the main things that we learned was that not all content types are great for machine translation, and this is one that we just don't think is. Sentence level translation would be much better than story arc level translation for this engine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.